everyone. Welcome. I hope everybody's energized. It's been a long day, a lot of really interesting sessions, but also just a lot of sessions. I know I just drank this much coffee, so I'm feeling like it's morning again. I want to welcome everybody. My name is Matt Bailey. I direct IFES's digital technology work around the world. I'm very, very glad to be here. I'm going to give very, very quick, just sort of run of show notes and then hand off to our president and CEO, Tony Banbury. Today, we're doing two things. One, we're launching the voluntary election integrity guidelines for technology companies. And two, we're issuing a call to action, call to engagement. We're hoping everybody here and the larger civil society and election sectors, as well as technology sector globally, will engage with this effort and help us continue to improve and expand and implement these guidelines globally over the next year, the next 2 years and beyond. So what we're going to do today is we'll have a little speech making. I'll walk you through the guidelines themselves, show you the website so you can find them and pore over them at your leisure. Then we'll have a panel. We'll have a couple more speakers. We'll do a little Q&A, and then we'll declare victory and go home. So that's our run of show. With that, I'm going to hand off to Tony Banbury.
Oh, gosh. You can go back to the other one. Oh. There. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Tony Banbury. I'm the president and CEO of IFES. Very happy to be here. I'm not going to make a speech, but I do want to share some thoughts with you. Want to start off, though, by thanking my colleague Matt Bailey and our other colleague Lisa Rappel, who have been so instrumental in getting us to where we are today, together with many other friends and colleagues from technology companies, election management bodies, and civil society. So thank you. Great to have you all here. Thanks for being here. This is a pretty exciting day, I would say, for not just IFES, but the election community because of the launch of these guidelines. But before I go into that, I want to share just a couple words about IFES and how we got here. As some of you probably still think, IFES for the first 30 years or so of its history was really a elections technical assistance organization. But then for a variety of reasons, threats to democracy, growing authoritarianism, backsliding, we switched to becoming a democracy organization, essentially, about 5 years ago. And when we did that, we took on 3 additional work streams in addition to the elections one. One is supporting important government structures and processes that are essential for democracy, but not elections. So anti-corruption bodies dealing with political corruption, electoral judicial bodies, campaign finance bodies, that kind of work. The third area is inclusion, and a very strong commitment that I think all of us have here to making sure that political processes, electoral processes are very inclusive. And then the fourth was trying to make sure technology, data, information serves democracy rather than undermines it. That's the practice that Matt leads at IFES. He has a formal title, but basically that's his role, to try and make sure technology, data, information serve democracy and don't undermine it. Yesterday, we heard a lot about technology having to serve democracy, not undermine it. We heard a lot about building resilient democracies that deliver for all, which, by the way, is the IFES mission statement. Together we build resilient democracies that deliver for all. We heard a lot about the importance of trust in government institutions and electoral processes, and the importance of having multi-stakeholder events or engagements, thinking, collaboration. And this initiative brings all that together. There's a lot on trust, there's a lot on resilience, it's a multi-stakeholder engagement. It's about making technology serve democracy rather than undermine it. One of the conclusions that IFES reached in the past couple of years, working closely with our election partners around the world, is that The single biggest responsibility election management bodies have now, compared to what had traditionally been the case, is building and sustaining the trust of the population of that country, the voters, in the electoral process. They still have a huge responsibility to administer free and fair elections, but before that was enough. Now it's not enough because election management bodies, together with so many other government entities and non-government entities, are the subject of just massive misinformation, disinformation campaigns, often with the deliberate objective to undermine the trust in the election body, in the individual commissioners, in the process. And if the voters don't trust the institution, don't trust the process, they don't trust the result, they don't trust the leaders who get put into office from the electoral process, and then everything starts breaking down, right? You don't think the government's legitimate, they're not going to do anything for you. So we really, as part of the last Summit for Democracy, working with our election authority partners, working in the election integrity cohort that we co-led with the Election Commission of India, thought about what are we going to do about this? Okay, we have this huge new biggest challenge to elections that's out there. And it's not just misinformation, disinformation campaigns, it's also cyber attacks. It's shutting down the internet when there are protests, and we just saw some clear examples of that yesterday, where internet in different areas of a country was being shut down because of the protests going on. So given all that, what can we do? What's something practical that we can do? And what we decided was to try and work through the election integrity cohort with election authority partners that we know well, technology company partners that we have increasingly worked with, and some civil society partners to try and come up with some voluntary guidelines for technology companies who are deeply engaged in this work in the United States, the European Union, but engaged to various levels in the kinds of countries where IFES works, for instance. We spent a bunch of time talking together, and big thanks to the Rockefeller Foundation for supporting this effort and convening and bringing together these different stakeholders. And the end result of it is these guidelines. Now, I want to say two things that I think are really important that these guidelines do, but first, a few caveats or limitations. These guidelines are not going to solve all the problems of misinformation in politics. They don't even try and deal with misinformation in politics. They're only focused on misinformation, disinformation around elections and the conduct of elections, election integrity. They do not apply to all countries around the world. There are other legal and regulatory regimes in some areas like the European Union, or there are commitments that the technology companies have entered into with, say, an election management body. India, for some tech companies, huge elections coming up, there are already formal relationships there. So these guidelines are meant to apply in a much more limited number of countries. And even if they were applied 100% effectively, and of course that won't happen, there are still going to be problems of misinformation around elections. I mean, that's just inevitable. With those limitations, I'm not going to walk through what the guidelines say. Matt's going to do that. But with those limitations, I think there are two really important things that these guidelines do. First, they start to build a bridge for communication between election authorities in the lots of countries around the world where there aren't these regulatory regimes, and the technology companies. We heard again and again and again from our election authority partners in countries around the world that they're drowning with this in the sea of misinformation, disinformation, and they don't have a partner on the other side they can work with. And that was very evident in the conversations between the EMBs and the tech companies. And so now these guidelines create a bridge for direct communication between election authorities and technology companies. And that's a huge one, I think. The second thing these guidelines do that's really valuable is to create a foundation on which to build further collaboration. These guidelines are a floor, not a ceiling. They are a place where, through cooperation, collaboration in the months and years ahead, additional voluntary undertakings can be made based on improved understanding. Or, for instance, if there are obligations that tech companies have on elections and information that come out of EU regulations, it's possible, because tech companies are obliged to fulfill those legal obligations on a voluntary basis, they can perhaps in some cases extend those practices into the other countries. So I think there's a good short-term value to these guidelines, but I really hope there's going to be a great long-term value. So I just end by expressing great appreciation to the technology companies that worked with us in collaboration to develop these voluntary guidelines. It's not easy. I think tech companies a lot of time get criticized for all kinds of things, some of it legitimate, some of it probably not, but it's important to understand the huge pressures they're under, regulatory, political, social. They are having to deal with so many competing demands and requirements. They also have bandwidth challenges, and on a voluntary basis, they have undertaken these to pursue the implementation of these guidelines in countries around the world, and that's a really valuable thing that they've done. So I hope that as you learn more about them, you'll also see that these are going to really help improve election integrity in many countries around the world. One last thing, it's not for countries like Russia, Iran. You know, one big conversation around these guidelines was, well, where will they be applied? They're not going to be applied in countries where there's a totally co-opted EMB. So, but I think they're going to be great. So with that, I'll turn it back to Matt.
Tony was a little nervous he wasn't going to get applause, but when it happened, he got a little smile, so it was nice. Okay, all right. Okay, so it's great that we have these things called guidelines, but what are we actually talking about? I think, as probably most of us know in this space, there's no shortage of paper that's been thrown at all of these problems that we're talking about. What we wanted to do, as Tony mentioned, is something very focused in terms of scope and tactical, and something that we can continuously engage with, a living document. So I will share this URL with you in a second. This is our fancy website. But just to position this generally. So what you're going to see when you visit, it's electionsandtech.org. What you're going to see is a fairly short document. When you print it out, it's just over 3 pages, unless you adjust the font size. It has only 11 commitments. Each of the commitments is about yay big on the page. This is not pages and pages. It's not implementation guidance. There's a full page chapeau on it, which I'll come back to in a second. But what it seeks to do, as Tony was sort of sketching out, is create common terms for the discussion. So in this dynamic that IFES sees, and sort of Lisa and others on my team and myself are living day to day, when we interact with EMBs, including their technology teams, including commissioners on the one hand, and then technology companies, including folks who are working on human rights or democracy within the tech companies on the other, is that there's no shortage of goodwill to try to solve the various problems we're talking about. This isn't just misinformation, disinformation. We're also talking about cybersecurity. We're talking about internet throttling and shutdowns or targeted service interruptions. We're talking about technology-facilitated gender-based violence or just misogynist attacks against candidates and participants in democratic daily life. All of these sorts of full-spectrum sorts of issues are recognized on both sides. But ultimately, on the one hand, and this is a generalization, but folks within elections commissions around the world say, in essence, we know basically what's going on, but we don't actually know who to call, And if I do get somebody on the phone, or if I bump into them at a conference or at a coffee shop, I don't know what to ask for. I don't know what's on the menu. I don't know what the choices are. I don't know what the terms are, let alone the fact that they speak a whole world of election jargon and lawyerly jargon often. And then on the tech company side, it's actually a reciprocal problem. The tech company folks, even if they're folks who've been in and out of government in various roles, rarely have they worked in election-specific roles. It's a whole other like cul-de-sac of nerdery with its own words. And so when they come bearing gifts or offerings of partnership or just seeking to engage, they often don't quite know what to offer or what to ask for or what the words are that are common between their work and the work of the election communities. So what we sought to do here is just identify through joint dialogue with these two groups, what are the key kind of questions that really every conversation around electoral integrity globally should at least consider, even if they're not always universally applicable. So in the chapeau, which you can browse at your own leisure, it does two things. One is it narrows the scope to a very fairly fine point, like Tony was talking about a minute ago, electoral integrity, or even within that, frankly, in the current version, to engagement with elections authorities. But on the other hand, it's a kind of a very broad scope. With regards to the technology sector, it specifically says we're not just talking about big companies, or if you want in EU parlance, very large online platforms. What we're talking about here is everyone. So it specifically says we're talking about newer entrants to the marketplace. We're talking about startups. Maybe you're running an app in Nigeria that suddenly has gone big and is relevant to the upcoming election. And you've never had to think about elections before or what your obligations or your capabilities might be to support elections integrity. That's a really hard position to be in, especially if it happened overnight, right? You're contending with a million things, how to provision servers, how to figure out how to Dockerize everything. It's very, very difficult to figure out how to get started or even who you would call to figure out that problem. So we're looking at that issue. And then two, there's 100 different sectors within the technology sector, and we tend to get bogged down just talking about social media or social media plus search or social media plus online advertising. Those are certainly relevant, but we're also concerned in this document with bringing a much broader spectrum of technology players to the table. This means cybersecurity service providers, telecoms folks. This means the startups, apps and games where a lot of, especially sort of younger voters are actually exchanging information with each other and trying to agree actually as a social or information function. We're talking about really the full spectrum of anybody who could consider themselves a technology platform, service provider, or expert. And so what we're trying to do here is really, really focus on the domain and then maximize the number of people who are engaging on the problem set of that domain. So if you're still with me, I will kind of jump into it. So here's the chapeau. I was meant to have advanced the slide a little further already. What you can see there, if you've got good eyes on the left, is that they're basically, aside from the chapeau, this preamble that scopes things, as I mentioned, 3 sections. If you work in elections, you'll recognize these as loosely describing the electoral life cycle. They're sort of before, during, and after. So in these 11 commitments, we say, first of all, what should you do in thinking about an upcoming election as a technology company? Then secondly, what are considerations through sort of the immediate electoral operation window? Like how do you actually do stuff while the election's going on? And then lastly, and this is actually my favorite part, how should companies think about their engagement after the election? And this here means not just the immediate post-election window, so the voters have voted, and then there's usually at least a couple days, if not a couple months, of sort of suspense while we figure out who's prevailed in the election itself for the official results, or worse yet, the judiciary getting involved and actually having to have lawsuits. But there's also like long-term elections observation operations that are going on. There's retrospective reporting by academics. So there's a whole long tail on many elections, especially major elections, where there's a role for technology companies to play, even if it's a soft one, in advising, providing data, and coordinating to make sure that there's a good historical understanding of what happened in these elections. So that's basically the story arc. I'm not going to run you through all of the 11 commitments just to spare you, but a couple of key points. The second commitment says, I'll paraphrase here, but not by much, step one, figure out if you should talk to the Election Commission at all. One thing that people who are sort of new to the elections space often are surprised by is the diversity of what elections management bodies, elections commissions are. They range from, as Tony was mentioning just now, and also in some remarks he gave earlier today, theater production companies like we have in Russia, for example, who are not actually in the business of holding elections. They're in the business of creating PR stunts, right? But there's also sort of the vast majority of elections commissions in the world are like doing their job, but with a lot of complications. These complications can come in the form of what is your constitutional mandate or your legislative mandate. It might include figuring out what the boundary delimitations are, where are the voting districts. It might include legal mandates to enforce hate speech laws. It might include prohibitions against enforcing hate speech laws. There's all sorts of complications. And within certain elections commissions, some parts might be politically captured and be not appropriate to work with, broadly speaking, and other departments or sections might be the perfect partners, ones you should be working with. So just like in all other aspects of our work on democracy and human rights, context. It's incredibly important. Localization of the approach is incredibly important. So the second commitment is key to the entire rest of the document. It says, step one, talk with experts in civil society and tailor your approach. From there, it's a bunch of fairly straightforward considerations in sourcing authoritative information, combating online harms, and so forth. And one other highlight, and then I'll kind of talk about where we're taking this next, is making sure that there are consistent and consistently applied escalation channels. So how, as an election commission, if it's appropriate in that context, can you, when you identify urgent issues relating to the election, can you escalate with companies for them to evaluate and perhaps take action on if it's appropriate within law and within their established policies? So if you're a person who's been working in the election space, you'll read this document and it will seem fairly straightforward. But again, the purpose here is a foundation for shared dialogue and to identify, like, what does good look like? How do we tailor this? What does this mean? And this tension that we have constantly in our space between scalability, in particular from the tech companies side, as well as from those of us who are reliant on funding, scalability versus localization, constantly in tension. And at the center of that is sort of an ethics of electoral integrity. So this is kind of what we're diving to the heart of. I'm trying to remember if I have got another slide. Yes. So these are all of the things I just said, but I didn't flip through. So here on my last slide. So highlighted in blue at the bottom is the URL. If you didn't catch it earlier, it's electionsandtech.org. You'll find a bunch more information there, including a bunch of invitations to engage. So as I mentioned earlier, we're launching this site, like right now. You're experiencing it in real time. It's being launched. But we're also asking you to engage with us going forward. We're putting kind of a shape to exactly what this is going to look like. I think we'll establish some sort of a steering committee or an engagement group. If you're interested in being involved in that, or you know other organizations you work with, particularly ones that are not American, global majority, are working on issues related to disadvantaged communities or disproportionately impacted communities, we need your help. So please, if you have time, if this sounds interesting and useful in your work and your mission, please email us at info@ifes.org. You can find that on the website. Please tell us who we should be reaching out to and inviting in. And what we're going to be doing, we've already started already, is consulting to figure out how we can actually improve these. And written into the chapeau is language that says these will be updated in 12 to 18 months. So we're going to move on a very aggressive time frame to start putting these into practice and learning where the rough spots are, where we need to further articulate it. And for all of these other tech players and all of these contexts that we talked about, where does it kind of work and where does it not really speak quite the right language? So that is what we are launching today. Now we are going to go into a quick panel. So if I could invite forward our panelists, Amy, Shane, Jorge. Let's see. Let's do this. Okay. So this will be a brief panel, and as I mentioned earlier, we're going to just have a quick discussion, sort of scene setting for this. What does this look like in practice? And then we're going to have a couple more speakers, and then we'll do a Q&A with our remaining time. So I think what might be simplest would be if I just ask you each to go down the line, introduce yourself, what's your work, and how are you thinking about these issues broadly right now? Do you mind going first, Amy?
Of course.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Amy Larson, and I'm the Director of Global Engagement within the Democracy Forward team at Microsoft. And first, I want to thank IFES and everyone here for showing up and being interested in this topic. It's a really exciting year, obviously, with over 3/4 of the world's democracies going to the polls, and we're excited to be part of what that means and how to show up in a really responsible way on the tech side. So the Democracy Forward group exists within our Technology for Fundamental Rights organization within Microsoft. And the goal there is that understanding that tech can be put to good and bad uses by actors all over the world. We want to make sure that we are deploying technology in support of fundamental rights and the systems that enable the support of fundamental rights, so including democracy and elections, for example. And we work across several different areas: open and secure democratic processes, information integrity, which involves some of our media literacy and journalism work, and also a robust civic engagement portfolio as well. And my work involves working on global elections, as well as the AI pieces of some of those efforts. And we've also been helping to coordinate the company's response to the war in Ukraine as well. So what does this mean for right now? First of all, we're so excited to be part of this hard work and this launch. You know, it's really exciting, I think, to have something to celebrate, and also that is an invitation for more good work and collaboration to come. So really glad that we can have this event here at the Summit for Democracy, and that there has been so much attention to the intersection of technology and democracy at this summit. Some of the issues that are top of mind for us as we enter and move through this elections year are really making sure that technology is supporting and defending democracy. So, of course, one recent announcement was at the Munich Security Conference last month, where we announced the Tech Accord to combat the deceptive use of AI in elections. And it's really intended to make these technologies harder to use by bad actors. And of course, they have the potential to be used for good and bad. And so we're really invested in making sure that we're on the good side of that. We also have a suite of programs to protect different stakeholders of democracy, so journalists, nonprofits, election officials. That's our Account Guard program. We really want to make sure that we are looking back on this year and saying, you know, did we show up for democracy? Let's make sure that we give our best effort. And so those are some of the pieces that involves.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Shane Huntley, and I'm the Senior Director of Google's Threat Analysis Group. So I've been at Google 13 years, and my team counters serious threats to Google and our users. And I've been through a couple of election cycles now, and some of the serious threats to Google and our users, and especially to our users, actually come in the forms of elections. And I'm really excited to see how far we've all come together in the approach in terms of thinking about election security over the last at least sort of 8 years. And I think it's super important that we actually do come together as civil society, as NGOs, as governments, and as the tech industry to actually push forward here. And we're also kind of very supportive of these like new guidelines coming out here. Like we have, and really I think these guidelines really just do enforce what we see as our approach to this. Like we have long-standing policies against harmful content on both YouTube and our other products. And we're also trying to be building our tools across search and maps and everywhere else to make sure people do have this definitive information about elections, they aren't misled, and that they can actually get reliable sources, which is incredibly important for building the trust in the electoral process and in the systems. We also, and this partnership needs to come through building these connections through nonpartisan sources. We need to have these trusted sources of information that we are surfacing. And that's what tech companies, especially a search company, is doing. It's surfacing information and having that trusted information that's able to be surfaced, and also being able to build that reliability and get us out of the process. These elections are not about us, they're about the will of the people. So the area that I'm sort of focusing more on, and kind of my area of expertise though, is actually about the high risk users and thinking about the cyber threats to these both campaigns, individuals, and the process in general. So we've seen in the past hack and leak operations, we've seen intimidation, we've seen information operations and intimidation. And we believe that understanding these threats and countering them is critically important, and that we all have a part to play in bringing together this and actually surfacing what is going on. So and also we have to enable others to do their own security. So we have programs like Advanced Protection, which should increase people's account security. We're running sessions for candidates. We're working with election officials around the world. We're giving out security keys, because really, even if people aren't voting online, the cybersecurity of people involved in elections actually is part of the security of elections, and is part of maintaining faith in the electoral process. And as spoken here also, we're also building out our policies and adapting them over time. With the rise of generative AI, with the rise of which again has incredible potential for people in terms of freedom of expression and being able to solve their problems, but also represents new capabilities for threat actors to use these capabilities against our electoral processes. And that's why we already have very strong policies around the use of generative AI and labeling anything which is created when it's related to elections, and we're expanding our policies on YouTube today in that way. So we're going into this year very prepared. My team is going to be working around the clock with many other teams around Google. We don't know what to expect for all of these elections. Every election cycle has been different. They haven't looked like the previous ones. We're not going to have a repeat of 2016 or 2020 or 2022. Who knows what Iran, Russia, any other actor is going to come up with, but we want to be prepared. We want to have the partnerships. We want to have the guidelines of how we're going to all work together to sort of maintain this process and to defend democracy around the world. So thank you.
Thank you. And I'm very excited to hear from Jorge. So Jorge is he's carrying the entire gauntlet of the elections community on the panel today. Jorge, please.
Thank you, Matt. My name is Jorge Zuncar. As you can see, I'm from Dominican Republic. This is my flag. I also work for the Junta Central Electoral. It's the Electoral Central Board of Dominican Republic. I am in the other side of the bridge that President Tony mentioned during his words, and I'm here to see what's going to happen. We believe in these guidelines. I think this gives a very worldwide scope of what we need, what we can do together in order to increase the confidence in our election. In order for companies to make money, we need to have democracy. So we provide the energies, the tools for the people to vote, and you provide the conditions that we can use. So if we get together, I think we can match and we can do better in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Jorge, I'm going to ask you to speak again. Are you ready? Okay. I know you've had a long career in the election space, and you've seen in your time We were talking before the event about how technology went from perhaps not very relevant to conducting elections to extremely relevant to conducting elections. I was wondering if you could just share what you've seen and what's changed, what's on your mind.
Every election is different, as you said. We can have that in all the countries, especially in Latin America, where we are sometimes a little behind than developing countries. But we are trying to do our best, especially in our case, in Dominican Republic. We had, since 1966, we've been having elections every 4 years, and we are growing in order to organize our elections in our country. These guidelines should help all the electoral organizations body in order to design a program that ensure that the citizens believe more in what we do. The citizens are the most important part of any election. If they don't believe in what we are doing, if they think that it's going to be a fraud, or they think that elections are managed by some strange forces, the people will not come down and vote. So that's why we need to help the people to understand, and these guidelines that IFES is providing to us are not the solution. Maybe we need more, and sure we're going to have to increase that. Some of those will apply in some countries, as the President said, some will not, but we need to work together in order to develop a scenario that we can work together, companies and organizations electoral in our countries. In order to increase the confidence, we need to provide and to have a strategy that take in consideration what are the levels of cybersecurity that we can have in our country. We believe in technology. We need the technology in order to have a counting process fast. People today want to know as soon as possible who won the election. They don't want to wait for 3 or 4 days like happens in the past. Now we have a competition between the electoral bodies in order to see which one is the faster in provide the result to the people. In Latin America, we have different kind of procedures to do that. If you go to Colombia, for example, in half an hour, you can have approximately a result because they use telephone lines. When they finish counting the vote, somebody goes to a telephone, make a phone call to the central, and he's reading the paper and saying, Party 1, 1,000. Party B, 800. Party C, 400. If you do that in Dominican Republic, people will ask, is this guy reading exactly the result of the table where I vote? Is this guy listening exactly what I said? Is the other guy at the end of the line making notes as I pronounce? So all these questions give the people an awareness. So that's why we need technology in order to have a better process in our electoral system. We have to analyze and identify the needs of the people and what is against the system. Especially today in cybersecurity area, where we have all these specialists called hackers everywhere, all this misinformation going around, that we need to be ready to fight those situations. We also need to have a narrative against fraud. Now, the electoral organization bodies are in the center of critical situation. Now, the people criticize the body, criticize the person, criticize the family of the people that is working in the election, and all that we need to have the way to defense from all these apps, social media, all this new technology, because today everybody has the power to say anything. There's no only one way to speak. Everybody speaks today. And the electoral bodies have to take care of that. In order to sustain the integrity of our responsibility, we need to believe that the electoral integrity is a responsibility of everybody. Not only the people that work in the electoral bodies, not only the citizens that vote, not only the companies that provide the technology, we all together have to work in order to maintain the electoral integrity everywhere. This will be my initial comments in this panel. I want to thank IFES for the invitation, and we're very pleased to be here.
Thank you so much. And I think already in Jorge's amazing remarks, for people who work in technology or in information integrity, you heard things like hybrid threats. You heard things like the dynamics of underfunded government agencies trying to protect against ever-increasing sophisticated cyber attacks, the economic mismatch that's happening there, where the attacks, the cyber attacks for hire and so forth, are getting cheaper and cheaper and more sophisticated, while the government budgets are staying the same. A few months ago, Tony and I were in a meeting with the Australian Election Commission, and they sort of were musing that the costs of elections have gone through the roof in the last, let's say, 10 years, but the budgets have stayed the same. And that budget increase is essentially all about these types of issues, cyber and information integrity issues. So there's a real struggle that's happening there, and elections commissions aren't lacking the words to describe it. They're lacking the words to figure out how to unlock the holistic support that they need, that Jorge is speaking to. Shane, I was wondering actually if you could talk a little bit about the cyber environment in general, what you're seeing. I know it's a risky business making forecasts about what's going to happen, and in fact, you just said we don't know what's going to happen, but we've got you. You're captive. I wonder. So specifically, I'm interested in this issue of the changing economics of cybersecurity and how you're thinking about that with regards to these high-value targets of government or critical infrastructure. Help us think through that.
Yeah, it's a very great, but very broad and daunting question.
Anytime.
We sort of split this up in two ones, right? Like, I kind of think of it, the economic cost is going down of these attacks in some ways, but they've never been that high as well, right? So we shouldn't pretend that hacking has always been a super high cost thing, right? And I track government-backed attackers, and it's sort of funny that every time somebody thinks about anything else, they don't think, man, if it's done by the government, it's going to be really, really good, except hacking, right? So just because it's government-backed doesn't mean it's super sophisticated. We are seeing a proliferation of activity through the use of commercial spyware, and I think we haven't seen that really used a lot in elections, though we have seen political parties targeted, we've seen journalists. The fact that there is this sort of capability from nations and others to be able to buy capability off the shelf to target civil society is having a chilling effect, and something that we are countering through other efforts. In terms of what we do expect out of sort of like cyber activities, what we're seeing is more and more nations with capabilities, but we're also seeing just different approaches to attacks. Like, I went in sort of 2016, there was like the hack and leak operations and the kind of compromise of the DNC. And so we went into 2020 kind of expecting everything, but everyone was really focused on sort of a repeat of 2016. Instead, what do we get? Like, one evening, I was like tracking down, sort of based on one lead, what was intimidation by the Proud Boys, a far-right group in the US. And then we did the investigations. We uncovered that it was actually a group from Iran. So I would not have expected at the start of 2020 to have Iran pretending to be the Proud Boys. And then in another case, we actually had a what looked like a start of a repeat of a presidential campaign being targeted by phishing, everyone was rushing to it being the Russians, and it was actually an 18-year-old from Rhode Island who had their own political beliefs. So that moral of the story is we're not seeing a lot directly so far, but we're prepared for anything because stuff is coming out of left field, right field, center field. So we have to be ready for every different actor coming in different ways. And on the information operations side and the information landscape, things have changed significantly because in 2016, people didn't realize hack and leak existed. Now people are looking for fake news and misinformation behind everything. So we actually run the risk also of false positives and people not having faith and people not believing anything they see, even when it's actually accurate. And then we're also coming to grips at this very moment in time as month by month generative AI and all these tools and how these things work is like we haven't got our head around all the different ways these tools can be used. We're starting to see threat actors use these tools in a very limited way to like deep fakes. But we have as a society need to work out how we grapple with that. We have a lot of technical mechanisms and policy mechanisms, but it's going to change the landscape in a way that means we can't totally extrapolate from a previous election to the next election, and we're going to have to bring the population with us in terms of how they think about what they see online, how we label things online, and what even truth means in terms of sort of like online activity. So it doesn't really answer your question, but it gives you some of the sort of landscape of the different ways we're thinking about it, and also how we need to be just so adaptive in this sort of amazing year of elections, but also this amazing year of AI.
Thank you, and I think you did a good job painting the complexity of the picture. And for those who don't work with EMBs, some have very sophisticated cyber capacities, but almost none. Like statistically speaking, none of them do. And so one of the things that IFES has really appreciated, that my team has really appreciated, working actually both with Google and with Microsoft, is efforts to figure out how to bring this sort of, I was about to say threat intelligence, but it's almost more like situational awareness for EMBs in thinking about like where are the threats, which ones should I be freaking out about, and almost just as importantly, or maybe more so, which should I not be freaking out about in a world of scarce resources? Should I be freaking out about AI, or should I wait until the next election cycle to start freaking out about AI, and I should worry about like Pegasus spyware, for example? Okay, so Amy, last word for you. Always the best spot to have, right? I'm curious, so pick your poison here. We just talked about cybersecurity. Your team is also doing great work on this. I've also really appreciated working with your team on sort of hybrid threats. So really looking at this full spectrum of issues. I'm curious sort of how you're thinking about that. The same basic question, we're in a zone of chaos. It's like a highly fluid situation with regards to the technology, but also these kind of like cookie cutter political techniques that are being applied around the world by authoritarians and would-be. How are you thinking about trying to provide maximum support through your work to the elections community?
Yeah, thanks. And I think adding on to some of the insights that Shane shared, I think we've also seen nation-state threat actors in particular get a lot better at using AI and associated tools in their efforts to develop video and images in particular in trying to create and deploy influence operations. So I think one of the ways that we try to sort of have a full approach, and it involves many teams at Microsoft, not just ours, is laying bare the kind of threat landscape as we're seeing and observing and tracking that kind of activity, both the cyber activity as well as the influence operations activity. And then I think one of the things that is really fantastic about this set of guidelines is that, as you were saying before, I think it really enables companies of all sizes to kind of come in at whatever point in the journey that they are coming from, whether it's a very experienced company or sort of fresh into the arena in this capacity. And I think that's really useful to be able to scale up and down. We also kind of try to do the same in our work and kind of meeting the needs of EMBs and election officials where they are We've also stood up for this election cycle, internationally as well as in the US, an elections communication hub that's a direct link for election officials into our team to really report on what they're seeing and see how we can be most helpful and triage the threats as they materialize, although hopefully they don't. So I think those are some of the ways that we are trying to respond across the hybrid threat landscape, and as well making sure that from the information literacy perspective, we're providing authoritative content as well, and really citing to authoritative sources so that people can have that confidence in what they're seeing and being part of this process. And I think that's a really critical way that we as tech companies can play a role in creating clarity and sort of through, whether it's through digital watermarks or sort of helping to clarify the authenticity of a source or how authoritative it is, or whether the kind of money is coming from a reliable source. I think there are all sorts of signals that we can help give people while still trying to kind of make sure that their desire to seek whatever information they want is also respected. So yeah, we're excited to be part of this and to continue to build from here.
Wonderful, thank you. I just, maybe a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you all for sharing. Okay, so we're gonna have 2 speakers now, and then we'll do Q&A with the remaining time and then close out. I think, Elena, if it's okay, I might reverse the order of the speakers, and Maher, maybe we can have you speak first, just out of respect for your time.
I'll take care of it. Yes. Hey, everybody. Thank you. My name is Maher Batar. I am the Deputy Assistant to the President and Coordinator for Intelligence and Defense Policy at the National Security Council at the White House in the United States. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. We're here to discuss what President Biden has called the defining challenge of our age, strengthening democracies. As you all know well, enabling citizens to choose their representatives in a manner that is free, fair, and credible is a bedrock of democracy. Technology can be a meaningful vehicle to strengthen democratic institutions globally, but it also can be misused to undermine them, as we've discussed over the last couple of days. The US has worked, including in close partnership with our esteemed host today, IFES, to safeguard electoral processes against foreign malign influence and foreign interference. Specifically, we have worked to first build the capacity of election authorities to ensure their processes and infrastructure are secure and trustworthy. Second, support local civil society, independent media, and observers to promote accurate information and responsible coverage. And third, to increase transparency to the public. Competent, prepared, and trusted election management bodies are critical to free and fair elections. They often serve as authoritative sources of information and have the mandate to respond to false or misleading information about the electoral process. This is why we've prioritized supporting election management bodies to combat foreign malign influence and strengthen cybersecurity. For example, the U.S. Agency for International Development supported the Brazilian Electoral Management Body to co-host with IFES an event for electoral management bodies around the globe to share strategies and lessons learned on mitigating and responding to election-related information manipulation. USAID also supports IFES and other implementing partners to conduct quote-unquote cyber hygiene training and provide technical assistance to electoral management bodies as well as to governments and legislatures to improve their cybersecurity and strengthen resilience measures. But technical solutions are only one piece of this puzzle. We've found that governments taking proactive measures to communicate their plans is critical to building trust with the public. While supporting governments, and especially election management bodies, to prevent and address foreign malign influence and election interference is critical, we cannot rely on government authorities to fully address this complex challenge on their own. A multi-stakeholder approach is needed, including fostering close partnerships with civil society, media, and election observers that serve as important sources of trusted fact-based information. That is why the Department of State and USAID support independent media, civil society fact-checking organizations, and international and domestic election observation missions around the world. For example, USAID has supported an organization in Ethiopia that investigates and verifies or debunks media information, images, and social media posts. In the lead up to the 2021 Ethiopian elections, their work was critical to providing factual reporting on electoral events. Given the increasing accessibility and use of generative artificial intelligence around elections across the globe, fact-checking may become increasingly difficult. Synthetic content has become significantly more realistic and accessible in recent months. Bad actors can disseminate deepfakes and other synthetic content more broadly while designing them in a way that are micro-targeted to bespoke communities. This new challenge in many ways requires many of the same solutions as ever. We need trusted independent media outlets. Governments need robust capacity and proactive messaging campaigns. We need multi-stakeholder communication between governments, civil society, academics, and tech platforms. But in some ways, these new dynamics do also require new solutions. That is why President Biden announced last summer that major AI companies have committed to watermarking synthetic content created by their publicly available systems. It's also why President Biden signed an executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy artificial intelligence, which directed the Office of Management and Budget in the United States to issue guidance to US departments and agencies to authenticate and label certain authoritative government information, such as information about elections. And it's why Vice President Harris last October called on other countries to do the same. In many ways, the solutions to the risks posed by AI to election integrity are very old. Fact-checking, credible election observers, and trusted reporting. But at the same time, these new solutions and governance approaches are needed to enable those very same actors to be able to do their jobs effectively. So as dynamics and threats to democracy evolve, our strategies need to and will as well. Collaboration, therefore, with international industry, civil society, and academic partners is critical. And this is why we're glad to be here and to hear the perspectives today. So on that note, thank you very much.
Maher, thank you so much. We're so appreciative of the support, of course, of USAID and state and the president's leadership on these issues, which are so critical at this point in time. And we, of course, appreciate your establishment of the Summit for Democracy, which is now in its third iteration. I'd now like to offer the microphone to Eleni Hickok, who is the manager of GNI, Global Network Initiative, who will provide a little bit of a civil society perspective on initiatives like these. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matt, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Eleni Hickok, and as Matt said, I'm the Managing Director at the Global Network Initiative. Maybe first, just a minute on GNI. So we are a multi-stakeholder initiative working to promote responsible decision-making in the ICT sector. We bring together companies, civil society, academia, and investors, and all of our members commit to the GNI principles on freedom of expression and privacy, and our company members undertake an independent assessment to understand how they are responding to government requests for access to data and removal of content. And part of that includes undertaking due diligence, having in place policies and processes to respond to these challenges that exist outside of elections, but also within elections. And so one, I would just emphasize as companies gear up for elections, the importance of undertaking due diligence, of committing to international human rights frameworks, of engaging with stakeholders, being transparent, et cetera. And maybe particularly on these guidelines, one, congratulations on the launch of the guidelines. I think they are a really important step and part of this larger ecosystem we see of initiatives coming together in terms of defining norms and best practices on how companies need to engage in elections going forward. And I think a real strength of these guidelines is just the emphasis that they place on collaboration with civil society kind of at every step of the decision making. When you're a company and you're trying to understand, okay, what is the unique policy that I might need to put in place for X jurisdiction? How long does that policy need to be in place? When is it the right time to escalate and de-escalate? All of these are very complex decisions, actually, and they need to be taken in consultation with local stakeholders to understand what is the nuance of the information environment, what is the reliability of the different actors. I think it's great that the guidelines do call out that we can't take actors at face value sometimes, and companies really need to dig in and do research and understand the environment that they are operating in. And I would say that in particular, it's important that this engagement happens with global majority stakeholders. Sometimes these are the most vulnerable contexts, and so companies should be really diligent and intentional in their engagement with global majority stakeholders. And lastly, I would just say that this is, these guidelines are one in multiple initiatives, and it will be important to continue to dialogue and to share and to learn from the other initiatives around information integrity, elections, et cetera. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak, and congratulations again on the launch of the guidelines.
In the grand tradition of all events like this, since the dawn of time, we're running a little bit behind schedule. So I think we'll just have time for a few questions. Perhaps if we could maybe just put your hand up if you have a question. We'll batch maybe 3 questions, and feel free to specify if they're for one of us in particular, and we'll address them to the best that we're able. I see more, surprisingly, with a question. Are there others? Hands?
So I get to go first. Come on, think of questions. Thank you, Matt. Maura Whalen from the National Democratic Institute. And I want to congratulate you guys on this effort. I think for those of you who don't sort of spend your lives on this, these important aspects of swim lanes, right? All of us who do this work, taking on the small pieces that come together. And so in true NDI fashion, partnering with IFES, it would not be complete if I didn't ask you about independent election observer groups and how they might be able to connect with these commitments. And right, because we often see that the independent election observers are the first ones to see the challenges before the EMBs. So as I realize, we've started small, we've started with a really finite problem, but I would be interested to know, both from the panel and from IFES, how we can build on that and where we can then bring that piece into the conversation.
Wonderful. I see another question over here. Please.
Thank you so much. My name is Rina Nioni. I'm the Human Rights, Democracy and Rule of Law Ambassador from Sweden. I'm curious, we talk a lot about this, that there is no one size fits all. So I'm curious about the work that you have done. To what extent, does this actually work everywhere? And when you talked about sort of going forward and getting more actors involved, is that part of getting that specific angle also into this project? Or if you could just comment on that, it would be interesting to hear. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Michael Baldessaro from the Carter Center, and I just want to say congratulations again. This is a very important initiative and a very good, albeit thin, substrate upon which we can sort of expand upon and use hopefully as a set of model commitments for which we can engage on the ground, because as you well know, a lot of it has been very ad hoc and frankly self-interested in some cases, the way that platforms will interact. My question is the underpinnings of this, the grounding of it. So how much of the principles is sort of either derivative of or built on the basis of things like the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights? So how much is this tethered to existing sort of international human rights standards so that we can hopefully enmesh this as part of a broader initiative, not just within the existing set of initiatives that are already sort of in the stream, but within the the big body of international human rights principles?
Great. So we have three questions that all sounded alarmingly like they might be directed at me, but I'm going to try to generalize them. So the first question was around how could we carve out a space or a role or integrate a role for independent election observer groups. Second one was this question, I think, of localization, or how can we consider a document that's only about 3 pages long with 11 total commitments. How do we think about localization to the specifics that we always encounter in any given context? And the third is the question of sort of the relationship of this document to, I think you were asking about sort of established frameworks, even like human rights law, frankly, but I would actually broaden that to sort of all the other paper that's out there, Santa Clara principles and straight on down the line. How do we sort of position these things? The first one sounded the most generalizable to me. I'm curious if anybody at the table has thoughts about independent election observation groups, or even just sort of the role of local actors who are trying to create accountability, in some cases for the EMBs. For example, one that comes to mind for me in Kenya is Kictonet. They do brilliant and increasingly sophisticated election technology observation. So literally like showing up at the polls and looking at how the election technology is functioning, as well as observing the online environment. And I know Microsoft in particular works with a lot of civic groups, CSOs, local CSOs. Amy, I'm curious if you have any thoughts in this neighborhood.
Yeah, I think it's something that we're definitely paying more and more attention to, and a couple members of our team have been part of election observation missions. So obviously kind of a crucial point in the process and part of those that could reasonably be considered part of these groups that, for example, our Account Guard program operates in 33 countries and protects over 5 million inboxes, and it'd be interesting to explore the applicability of that beyond the kind of core cohorts that we've established so far, election officials and campaigns and politicians, journalists, all of those that are kind of vulnerable and highly targeted sort of cohorts within the democratic process, because obviously this is also, has been and may continue to be a targeted group. So something that we are paying increasing attention to, and so I guess watch this space for more. So yeah, and in addition to our partnerships, of course, with IRI and NDI and IFES on a number of other types of initiatives as well. We partnered with IFES as well recently to help train women journalists in Serbia and to help investigate the corruption of state resources. So I think it's a broad view that we take of how we can ensure accountability and sort of help technology play a positive and sustaining role for democracy.
Thank you. And I would say in terms of the evolution of the document itself, I think this is a perfect provocation. So I think this will be one of my post-session notes, is to write this down alongside other feedback we've already received. We did a briefing, Lisa Rappel, who we mentioned earlier, and I did a briefing for GNI members a little while ago. I won't share anything specific that any of them said because there's sort of a Chatham House rule. But one of the insights that came out of that discussion is that there's a real need to explicitly address free expression in this document. The words free expression don't appear currently in the document. The words human rights do, so I guess you could extend that. But there's a need to really articulate this balance between online harm versus the preservation of space for free and contentious dialogue and discourse in the context of democracy and elections. So these sorts of issues, some of them are like pretty big issues or low-hanging fruit, if you want to think about it that way. This is exactly why we want to broaden sort of the space for engagement around what should be in the principles. And I would say with the question of independent election observer groups, I don't see a reason why there shouldn't be a commitment or a clause related specifically to their role and ensuring that there's some sort of articulation or a balancing or a separation of duties in how companies are engaging with EMBs versus those groups, and creating a firewall in their engagements, which is very, very important. So these ideas are exactly what we're hoping to surface. The second question was this question of localization. So how do you have sort of global principles versus local application? I'll share one thing that we're thinking about here, and again, this actually comes out of GNI land. They've done some very thoughtful work over the years creating implementation guidelines. So this is like more verbose descriptions of how you might apply a high-level principle in a particular context. So we're exploring kind of like what the right model might look like for that. And I think it's a particularly important one for these guidelines, given the ambition to cover all of these disparate fields of technology. If you talk about holistically consulting with local and global civil society about how to engage with an EMB, an election authority, and you're a cybersecurity service provider, versus if you are providing a Roblox clone that somehow is popular with 18 to 22-year-olds, your discussions you need to have are going to be wildly different, and the level of sort of technical sophistication you might need to bring to the conversation might be completely different. And so that's the sort of thing that you really can't prescribe in a short, concise, easy to understand principle, let alone how do you do that in, I'll use Kenya again as an example, just because I just mentioned them, versus in the Dominican Republic, cultural, logistical, legal, economic considerations are going to vary vastly, even next door neighbors, let alone two countries as far apart as those. So this is where I think we need to figure out a balance between getting all of the core of the substance into the principles versus creating an unwieldy and unusable document. I think that we largely as a global community have failed at this to date, so I'm not saying we're going to succeed, but there's a balance to be struck. I think we all find the Universal Declaration a handy reference model. You can just reach for it and say, this is something that's mentioned here, and it's useful because it's concise. But we also know, as soon as you try to apply it, things get hairy really quickly. And so I think we're going to run headlong into that question as we move forward. And again, this is why we need a big tent to consult with people from around the world and in different roles. Our third question I've already lost. I knew I was going to. Yes. Yeah, and here actually I might put our tech company colleagues on the spot again briefly, warning I'm about to mention the DSA. I think that so far we've held off on explicitly positioning this in terms of any given framework, with the exception of mentioning holistic human rights considerations, which I think you could construe as either a legalistic reference or not, depending on how you're choosing to apply it. We have not sought to sort of directly crosswalk this, although there exists a file on our shared drive where we sort of have done that crosswalk. But for people who have been paying attention to what's coming out of Europe, for people who are used to working within a human rights framework, you read this and you hear the echoes straight through. So an open question is, what's the most useful way to frame this so that it continues to be a document of common reference where elections officials, those of us working in global civil society or local human rights defenders or democracy defenders, and the companies themselves all feel comfortable gathering around the document. In some cases, it seems to me that it's a high utility to have it look like a softer version of things that are already regulatory requirements. But in some places, you can end up with very, very interested attorneys paying very, very close attention to the wording. So what we've tried to do is strike a balance there, sort of tactical ambiguity. There's a real question about whether that holds up. So I gave you a short warning on this. Feel free to demur because it's a hairy topic. But I'm curious, in engagements with civil society and others in the past or in your ongoing work, how would you advise this room is useful to sort of position documents like this? Is it useful to explicitly crosswalk them? Is it useful to have a position of ambiguity? What have you seen that's worked, I guess, might be a useful question.
It's a big question, and I'm very much a technologist, not a lawyer. So I'd say the only kind of point I'd make on it is that I think the approach of keeping them somewhat separate is more powerful. Like, it's kind of where things get routed and how things get assessed can really sort of be different from where you're coming from, right? So there's very difference between like how we're doing these elections, how we're going out and how we're sort of pushing forward to do the best possible use we can versus something becoming very much yes, we want to do the best we can, but a huge compliance oversight and a huge compliance risk, meaning that it's going to be really run by lawyers and a compliance side of things, which generally, as a technologist, I don't think gets us to the best solutions. It actually ends up sort of sucking a lot of the energy. It means that so much of the energy is actually going to making sure that we are not exposing ourselves to any legal risk versus doing the best possible job. And I think that's a way to really think about sort of, do you want to bring the lawyers in? And if you want to beat us up, bring the lawyers in. If you want to work with us to sort of how we can do the best job, then I think the sort of approach of having these as guidelines and having us voluntarily come to the table is the way to do it.
I mean, I would just add that I think it is important actually to reference international human rights frameworks and to reference things like the UNGPs in these documents, in part because when we've got different initiatives emerging, what it does is it helps draw a thread between them and set a standard so we're all within like a good broad framework. We've got like the baseline of human rights, and then these initiatives can start kind of branching out a little bit more, talking about electoral authorities, recommendations for governments, recommendations for companies, but we've got kind of a common baseline language. And so it doesn't turn into a compliance exercise, but it definitely helps harmonize and make sure we have a North Star for the recommendations that are coming out. So just adding that.
I think one of the values, I think, of this set of guidelines in particular is that it's very clearly derived from expertise of the community and group of stakeholders that this is most relevant to. And I would almost say that that's the most crucial, is that it actually serves the interests that we're trying to promote here, I think, of protecting the electoral process, protecting election officials, and protecting the information environment around that. So it's not an answer to that question because I'm not representing Microsoft in a legal capacity. But I think I really value, and we really value that aspect of where the document comes from, and also the fact that it provides kind of both a comprehensive but an approachable on-ramp for others. And as you said, it's the fact that it's voluntary and kind of in progress, I think, is healthy. It enables us to kind of update for other ideas and challenges that may come along in the future that we can't foresee. I think having a framework that allows that space to evolve and adapt is really important and useful.
Thank you. I appreciate you all just engaging with that question, even though it's straying into big, complex issues, frankly, that we had to wrangle through in the process of creation of this document. And I think they're going to be very present in its continued evolution. One beautiful thing that I think just happened here is we all started kind of co-creating the future of this document together. That's what I was hoping. You made me so happy. So we're going to hear from Tony to close us out, but I wanted to give Jorge, maybe somewhat in the spirit of what Amy just said, the last word. Whatever you want to say to us, Jorge. What do you have?
Thank you, Matt. I think we are referring to the same from both point of view. What you call clients from the tech companies' point of view, I call a citizen. It's the same people that is your client, that's going to buy your products. It's the same people that's going to vote in my electoral process. That's why I think this is a great opportunity. I think that IFES is thinking globally and promoting the people to act locally. And we have to adapt all this, what we are mentioning this afternoon, in our internal countries. We have to close with our legal framework. Something will be accepted in one country and not accepted in another one. But the most value for me that I'm taking back is that we have to do something. And it's a global responsibility to keep the integrity of the electoral process.
Thank you so much. Round of applause for our brave Q&A participants. Tony, can I invite you to steal a microphone from Eleni and bring us home? Yep. 30 seconds.
I will be very quick. I really want to thank all the panelists. Thank you so much for your insight. And your contributions. That was really helpful. I'm not going to try and rehash everything that was said. Everyone's smart and you heard it. But a couple of themes stuck out for me. One is the changing threat environment and how much has changed over, say, the course of Jorge's career and election management bodies really living that and overwhelmed by the magnitude of the threats, the fact that the costs and challenges of dealing with them have become so much greater while the resources available to election management bodies have changed. So this is a really difficult issue for election authorities around the world. And for all of us working on it, it's like that great, one of the greatest hockey players of all time, Wayne Gretzky from Canada. He was asked, why are you so great? And he's like, I don't skate to where the puck is, I skate to where it's going. And I think in a way, we have to think about that, the evolving nature of the threats of technology, misinformation, now AI. How do we help our partners, in this case, election authorities, not just deal with the problems of today, but prepare for these evolving challenges of the future? They cannot do it on their own. They need help of their governments, of partners like IFES, and very much the technology companies, and appreciate, again, so much their engagement on this. And I very much agree with what Shane said, and that was the spirit that we took into this. We have to recognize technology companies have their challenges. We can't force them, a little old IFES certainly can't force them to do anything, but taking that spirit of partnership, shared interests, they want their products and services to be used for good and not bad. They want their products and services to advance electoral integrity, just like election authorities want to advance electoral integrity. So bringing the community together, having election officials and technology officials at the table together, learning from each other, and trying to advance that common objective was what got us here, but we have so much further to go. And this really is just a start. We do have to broaden it, as Matt was said, and thanks to G&I, in the next 12 to 18 months, we're going to build on this, invite others in, improve on the guidelines, improve understanding and communication, and I'm really hopeful that we will skate to where the puck is and do something that is really going to advance electoral integrity in so many countries around the world. So thank you all again very much. Thank you for coming. Let's work together on this.